The doctor's hands were trembling as he stared at the denial letter, and across from him sat a man who had survived wars, raised 6 children, buried a wife, and never once asked the world for anything he hadn't earned. Now at 79 years old, with a heart valve so calcified it could stop beating any moment, James Crawford was being told that saving his life wasn't worth the cost. The insurance company's decision was final. No appeal would change it, no argument would matter. And in 6 weeks, maybe less, James would be gone. But what the doctor did next, in the 13 seconds of silence that followed, would expose a fracture in the system so deep that by the time the story reached the hospital board, the evening news, and eventually a courtroom, nothing would ever be the same. What he did wasn't in any medical textbook. It wasn't protocol. And technically, it could cost him everything he'd spent 30 years building. 3 months earlier, James Crawford was the kind of man you'd see at the hardware store on a Tuesday morning, moving slow but steady, asking questions about wood stain or the right gauge wire for a garden light. He lived in a small house on Maple Street, the same one he'd bought in 1972 when the neighborhood was still new and the trees were barely taller than his children. The house had good bones, he liked to say. It just needed someone to care for it. And James had spent 50 years doing exactly that, fixing the porch rail every spring, repainting the shutters every decade, keeping the gutters clear, because a clogged gutter, he'd tell anyone who'd listen, was how a house started to rot from the inside. His wife, Eleanor, had died 4 years ago. And since then, the house had gotten quieter, the garden had gotten smaller. But James still woke up every morning at 6, made his coffee the same way he always had, 2 scoops and a pinch of cinnamon, and he'd sit on the back porch watching the sun come up over the fence line, thinking about everything he'd built and everyone he'd loved and how much time he might have left to keep the garden going. He didn't feel old. That was the strange part. 79 didn't feel like a number that belonged to him. His knees ached when the weather changed, sure, and his back wasn't what it used to be, but his mind was sharp and his hands still worked, and he could still drive himself to the grocery store, still mow his own lawn, still cook his own meals. He had routines. He had independence. He had a life that felt like his own. And then one afternoon in late August, while he was pulling weeds along the side of the house, he felt it. A tightness in his chest. Not pain exactly, more like pressure. Like someone had placed a hand over his heart and was pressing down, firm but not violent. He straightened up, leaned against the fence, waited for it to pass. It didn't. The pressure stayed. His breath got short. Sweat broke out on his forehead even though the day wasn't that hot. And he thought, this is it. This is how it happens. Alone in the backyard, pulling weeds. No one around to call for help. But he didn't collapse. He didn't fall. He stood there, breathing slow, waiting. And after a minute, maybe 2, the pressure eased. His breath came back. The sweat cooled. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and told himself it was nothing. Overexertion, dehydration. He was 79 after all. He couldn't work in the heat like he used to. He went inside, drank a glass of water, sat down in his chair, and turned on the television. By the time the evening news came on, he'd almost forgotten about it.
But it happened again 2 days later, and then again the following week, each time the same pressure, the same shortness of breath, the same cold sweat. And each time James told himself it was nothing, because admitting it was something meant doctors, and doctors meant tests, and tests meant bad news. He'd seen what happened to people who went down that road. His brother had spent the last year of his life in and out of hospitals, tethered to machines, poked and prodded and measured and monitored, until he wasn't really living anymore, just existing in the space between one appointment and the next. James didn't want that. He wanted to wake up in his own bed, sit on his own porch, die in his own house when the time came, quietly, without fuss. But his daughter Rachel saw something was wrong. She'd been stopping by more often since Eleanor passed, bringing groceries, checking in, making sure he was eating real meals and not just toast and canned soup. And one Sunday afternoon when she came by, she found him sitting in his chair, pale, breathless, gripping the armrest like it was the only thing keeping him upright. She didn't ask if he was okay. She just said, "We're going to the hospital." And James, too tired to argue, let her help him to the car. The emergency room was bright and loud and full of people who looked worse off than he felt, and James sat in the waiting area thinking this was a waste of time, that they'd run some tests and tell him to take it easy and drink more water, and he'd be back home by dinner. But when they finally called his name and brought him back to a room with thin curtains and machines that beeped every few seconds, the doctor who examined him didn't look like someone about to send him home. She was young, maybe 40, with tired eyes and the kind of focus that made James feel like he was the only person in the building. She listened to his heart for a long time, longer than seemed necessary. Then she ordered tests, an EKG first, then blood work, then a chest x-ray, and then 2 hours later, an echocardiogram, which meant lying on his side while a technician moved a wand across his ribs, staring at a screen that showed his heart beating in real time, a gray, pulsing shape that looked nothing like the valentines his grandchildren used to draw. When the results came back, the young doctor sat down next to his bed and spoke in a voice that was gentle but direct. His aortic valve was failing, severely. The valve was supposed to open and close with each heartbeat, letting blood flow from his heart to the rest of his body. But James's valve had calcified, hardened with deposits that made it stiff and narrow. His heart was working 3 times as hard to push blood through an opening that was barely there. That's why he felt the pressure, the shortness of breath, the exhaustion. His heart was fighting a battle it couldn't win. And without surgery to replace the valve, the doctor said, looking him straight in the eye, he had maybe 6 months, maybe less. James didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at the ceiling, at the fluorescent lights that hummed faintly, at the water stain in the corner that someone had tried to paint over but hadn't quite covered. He thought about Eleanor, about the day they'd bought the house, about the morning she died in their bedroom, holding his hand, telling him not to be sad because she had a good life and so had he. He thought about his children, all 6 of them scattered across 3 states, living their own lives, raising their own families. He thought about his garden, about the tomatoes he'd planted in May that were just starting to ripen. And he thought, 6 months. That might be enough. Enough to see the leaves turn. Enough to have one more Christmas. Enough to finish the bookshelf he'd been building in the garage. But Rachel, sitting beside him, asked the question he couldn't. What about the surgery? Can he get the surgery? The young doctor nodded. There was a procedure, a valve replacement. It wasn't easy, especially at his age, but it was possible. It could give him years, good years, but it required approval from his insurance. And that, she said, her voice losing some of its confidence, could take time.
James went home that night with a referral to a cardiac surgeon and a prescription for medication that would help manage the symptoms but wouldn't fix the problem. Rachel drove him, and neither of them said much. When they pulled into his driveway, she asked if he wanted her to stay, and he said no, he was fine. He just needed to rest. She hugged him longer than usual before she left, and James went inside and sat in his chair and stared at the television without turning it on. The house felt emptier than it ever had. Not because Eleanor was gone, he'd gotten used to that, but because now there was a clock ticking that he could hear. 6 months, maybe less. And the only thing that could stop it was a surgery he wasn't sure he'd be allowed to have. The appointment with the cardiac surgeon was 3 weeks later, and by then, James had done what he always did when he didn't know what else to do. He kept working. He finished the bookshelf, he pruned the roses, he fixed the dripping faucet in the bathroom that had been annoying him for 2 years. He moved carefully, stopping when the pressure came, resting until it passed, and then getting back to work, because staying still felt like giving up, and James Crawford had never given up on anything in his life. The surgeon's office was in a medical building downtown, all glass and steel and too much air conditioning, and James sat in the waiting room filling out forms that asked questions he didn't know how to answer. Rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. How would you describe your quality of life? Have you experienced depression or anxiety in the past 6 months? He left most of them blank. When they called him back, the surgeon was older than the emergency room doctor, maybe 60, with gray hair and a calm, measured way of speaking that reminded James of his old battalion commander, a man who never wasted words and never made promises he couldn't keep. The surgeon looked at James's charts, at the echocardiogram images, at the notes from the ER visit. Then he looked at James. "You're 79, he said. "Not a question. A fact." James nodded. "And your valve is in bad shape. You're symptomatic, short of breath, chest pressure, fatigue." James nodded again. The surgeon leans back in his chair. "I can replace that valve. It's a major surgery, and recovery at your age will take time. But you're otherwise healthy. Your heart muscle is still strong, your lungs are clear. If we do this, you could have another 5, 10, maybe 15 years, good years. But here's the problem. Your insurance is going to look at your age, and they're going to run the numbers, and the numbers are going to tell them that spending $150,000 on a 79-year-old man isn't cost-effective. They'll call it a quality-of-life decision. They'll say the risk outweighs the benefit, and they'll deny it." James felt something cold settle in his chest. Not the pressure. Something different. Something worse. "So what do I do?" "We submit the request," the surgeon said. "We document everything. We make the case. And we hope." The request went in the next day. James went home and waited. 1 week passed, then 2, then 3. He stopped working on projects, stopped pulling weeds. He sat on the porch in the mornings and watched the sun come up. But now it felt different, like he was watching something he wouldn't get to see much longer. Rachel called every day. His other children started calling more, too. Their voices careful, asking how he was feeling, if he needed anything, if there was any news. He told them he was fine, that he was waiting, that everything would work out. But he didn't believe it. The denial letter came on a Thursday. Plain white envelope. Official letterhead. 2 paragraphs of dense bureaucratic language that boiled down to a single word. No. The insurance company had reviewed his case. They had considered his age, his medical history, the statistical outcomes for patients over 75 undergoing major cardiac surgery, and they had determined that the procedure was not medically necessary. Not medically necessary. As if his life, at 79, wasn't necessary anymore. As if the years he had left weren't worth saving. James read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and set it on the kitchen table. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just sat there, looking at the envelope, thinking about all the things he'd survived. The war, the depression before that, when he was just a boy and his family had lived on nothing but hope and stubbornness. The year Eleanor got sick and they thought they'd lose her, but she fought through it. The accident that nearly killed his youngest son. He'd survived all of it. And now, after everything, he was being told that saving his life wasn't worth the money. Rachel came over that evening and found the letter on the table. She read it, and James watched her face change, watched anger and heartbreak fight for control. She wanted to call a lawyer, file an appeal, fight. But James was tired. He told her there was no point. The decision was made, the system had decided, and he didn't have the energy to fight a system that had already decided he wasn't worth fighting for. But Rachel wasn't ready to give up. She called the surgeon's office the next morning, demanding to speak to someone, anyone, who could help. And that's how the letter ended up on the desk of Dr. Michael Torres, the cardiac surgeon who had examined James 3 weeks earlier. Dr. Torres read the denial. He looked at James's file, at the echocardiogram showing a valve so calcified it was a miracle the man was still walking, at the notes documenting his symptoms, at the surgeon's assessment that James was a viable candidate, that the surgery could work, that he could have years of meaningful life ahead of him. And Dr. Torres felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not frustration, not anger, something colder, something that made him pick up the phone and call James directly. They met 2 days later, not in the surgeon's office, but in a small consultation room on the third floor of the hospital. James came alone, didn't tell Rachel, didn't want her hopes up. Dr. Torres was already there when James arrived, sitting at a small table with James's file open in front of him. He gestured for James to sit. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Dr. Torres said. I've seen a lot of denials, but this one," he shook his head, "this one doesn't sit right with me." James didn't say anything, didn't know what there was to say. Dr. Torres leaned forward. "I want to do your surgery. I want to replace that valve. But your insurance won't cover it, and I can't make them." He paused. "But here's what I can do. I can waive my fee. The hospital's a different story. They have costs. Anesthesia, nursing staff, operating room time, recovery. But my fee, that's mine to waive, and I'm waiving it." James stared at him. "Why?" "Because you deserve to live," Dr. Torres said simply. "And because if I don't do this, I'm letting a system that values profit over people make my decisions for me. And I didn't spend 30 years learning how to save lives just to let a spreadsheet tell me whose life is worth saving." James felt something crack inside him, something he'd been holding together since the day he read the denial letter. His eyes burned. His throat tightened. He tried to speak but couldn't. Dr. Torres continued, "I've been talking to the hospital administrator. We're working on reducing the facility costs. There are programs, grants, funds for patients in situations like yours. It's going to take some time, maybe a few weeks, but we're going to make this happen." And that's when James Crawford, a man who had survived war and loss and 79 years of life's hardest blows, broke down and cried in front of a stranger who had decided that his life was worth saving after all. The next 3 weeks were a blur of phone calls and paperwork and meetings with people James had never heard of who worked in offices he didn't know existed. Dr. Torres was relentless. He called in favors. He reached out to a charitable foundation that funded surgeries for underinsured patients. He negotiated with the hospital billing department, arguing that James's case was exactly the kind of situation their hardship programs were designed for. Rachel helped too, filling out applications, gathering documents, making copies of everything. And slowly, piece by piece, the funding came together. Not all of it. The hospital couldn't waive everything, but between the foundation grant, the hardship program, and Dr. Torres waiving his entire surgical fee, the cost dropped from $150,000 to $8,000. Still a huge amount for a man living on Social Security. But James had savings. Money he and Eleanor had put away over the years for emergencies. Money he'd planned to leave to his children. And Rachel, when she found out how much was left to pay, started a crowdfunding page. She didn't ask James's permission. She just did it. She wrote about her father, about the man who had raised 6 children, who had served his country, who had never asked for help but needed it now. And within 48 hours, strangers from across the country had donated enough to cover the rest. James couldn't believe it. He read the messages people left with their donations. From a veteran in Texas who said he understood what it meant to feel abandoned by the system. From a woman in Oregon who had lost her own father to heart disease and wished she'd had a chance to save him. From a young couple in Florida who could only afford $5, but sent it anyway because, they wrote, every life matters. James sat at his kitchen table reading these messages from people he'd never meet. People who had given their money to save a stranger's life, and he cried again. But this time, they were different tears. The surgery was scheduled for October 15th. James spent the week before getting his house in order. Not because he thought he wouldn't come back, though the possibility was there, always there, hovering at the edge of every thought, but because he wanted everything to be ready. He fixed the loose board on the porch. He cleaned out the gutters one last time. He wrote letters to each of his children, sealed them in envelopes, and left them in the top drawer of his dresser, just in case. And the night before the surgery, Rachel stayed over. They didn't talk much. just sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out, listening to the crickets sing in the grass. And James thought about how strange it was that the worst moments of your life could also hold the most love. The hospital at 5 in the morning was quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. James checked in at the front desk, changed into a gown that tied in the back and left him feeling exposed and vulnerable, and lay down on a gurney in a pre-op room that smelled like disinfectant and nerves. Rachel held his hand. Dr. Torres came in, already in his scrubs, and explained what would happen, how long the surgery would take, what the recovery would look like, the risks. James listened, nodded, didn't ask questions. He trusted this man. Trusted him in a way he hadn't trusted anyone since Eleanor died. When the anesthesiologist came to start the IV, James looked at Rachel and said, "I'll see you when I wake up." And she smiled, her eyes wet, and said, "You better." Then they wheeled him down a long hallway under fluorescent lights that blurred together, through double doors that swung open automatically, into an operating room that was cold and bright and filled with people who moved with quiet efficiency. Someone placed a mask over his face and told him to count backward from 10. He got to 7. When he opened his eyes again, the world was soft and blurry and full of beeping. His chest hurt. Not the pressure he'd been feeling for months. Something different, sharper, more immediate. A nurse appeared, her face coming into focus slowly, and she told him the surgery was over, that it had gone well. The Dr. Torres had replaced his valve, and his heart was beating strong and steady. James tried to speak, but his throat was raw from the breathing tube. The nurse gave him ice chips and told him to rest. And James, exhausted in a way he'd never been before, closed his eyes and let himself drift.
Recovery was hard, harder than he'd expected. His chest felt like it had been cracked open, which it had. Every breath hurt. Every movement was slow and deliberate. He spent 5 days in the hospital, learning how to sit up without help, how to walk 10 feet down the hallway without getting dizzy, how to manage the pain and the exhaustion and the strange new awareness of his own heartbeat. But every day he got a little stronger. And every day Dr. Torres stopped by, checking his charts, asking how he felt, reminding him that this was normal, that his body had been through a war and needed time to heal. When James finally went home, Rachel had prepared everything. She'd cleaned the house, stocked the refrigerator, set up a bed downstairs so he wouldn't have to climb stairs. And for the next 6 weeks, she came by every day, helping him with things he couldn't do yet, like showering and getting dressed and preparing meals. His other children visited when they could, flying in for weekends, calling every night. And James, who had spent so much of his life being the strong one, the provider, the man who fixed things, learned what it felt like to let people take care of him. By Thanksgiving, he was walking without help. By Christmas, he was driving again. And by the time spring came around, when the trees on Maple Street started to bud and the air smelled like rain and new grass, James was back in his garden. He moved slower than he used to, took more breaks, but he was there, on his knees, in the dirt, planting tomatoes and peppers and the marigolds Eleanor had always loved. His chest still ached sometimes, a dull reminder of everything he'd been through. But his heart, the new valve clicking softly with each beat, was strong. Dr. Torres called one afternoon in late April, not for a medical check-in, but just to see how he was doing. James told him about the garden, about the tomatoes that were already flowering, about the way his granddaughter had visited last week and helped him plant sunflowers along the fence. And Dr. Torres, on the other end of the line, said he was glad, that he'd been thinking about James, that this, right here, this was why he'd become a doctor in the first place. But the story didn't end there, because what Dr. Torres had done, waiving his fee, fighting the system, rallying resources to save one man's life, hadn't gone unnoticed. A local journalist had heard about James's case, about the insurance denial and the surgeon who'd refused to accept it. She wrote an article. And then the article was picked up by a larger paper. And then a news station did a segment. And suddenly, James Crawford's story was everywhere. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. Because there were thousands of people just like James, people being denied care, people slipping through the cracks, people whose lives were being measured in dollars and deemed not worth the cost. The hospital board noticed, so did the insurance company. And 3 months after James's surgery, the insurance company quietly changed their policy on age-based denials for cardiac procedures. They didn't make a big announcement, didn't admit wrongdoing, but the policy changed, and Dr. Torres, who was just trying to save one man, had ended up changing the system for countless others. James didn't find out about the policy change until a reporter called to ask for his reaction. He didn't know what to say, didn't feel like a hero or a symbol or anything other than a 79-year-old man who'd gotten lucky. Lucky that he had a daughter who fought for him. Lucky that a doctor had cared enough to push back. Lucky that strangers had opened their wallets to save someone they'd never meet. He told the reporter all of that. And when the interview was over, he went back outside and finished pruning the roses. On a morning in early June, James was sitting on his porch with his coffee and cinnamon, watching the sun come up when a car pulled into his driveway. Dr. Torres got out, not in scrubs this time, but in jeans and a t-shirt, looking almost unrecognizable without the clinical setting. James stood up, surprised, and Dr. Torres walked over with an easy smile. "Thought I'd stop by," Dr. Torres said. "See the famous garden I've been hearing about."
James laughed, a sound that still felt new after everything, and led him around to the backyard. They walked slowly through the rows of plants, James pointing out the tomatoes and peppers, the marigolds, the sunflowers that were already waist-high. Dr. Torres asked questions, genuinely interested, and they talked like old friends rather than doctor and patient. And at some point, standing there in the garden with the morning sun warm on their faces, James said the thing he'd been trying to say for months but hadn't found the words for. "You gave me my life back." Dr. Torres looked at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Dr. Torres shook his head gently. "No. I just refuse to let them take it away. There's a difference. You did the rest. You fought. You survived. You're here because you're stronger than any system that tried to tell you otherwise." James didn't argue, just nodded. And they stood there together in the garden, two men who had been strangers 8 months ago, connected now by something neither of them could quite name, but both of them understood. That afternoon, after Dr. Torres left, James called Rachel, told her he'd been thinking about the money that had been donated, about the people who had helped save his life, and he wanted to do something. He wanted to set up a fund, something small, something that could help other people in his situation, people who were being told their lives weren't worth saving. Rachel said she'd help, said she'd been thinking the same thing, and within a month they'd created the Crawford Fund, named after James's wife, a small nonprofit that helped cover medical costs for elderly patients denied life-saving care. It started with $3,000, money James had left over from his savings and donations that had exceeded what he needed. By the end of the year, it had helped 4 people. By the end of the next year, 12. James didn't run the fund himself. He was too old for that, he said, laughing. But he was involved. He read every application, signed every check, and sometimes when a recipient wanted to say thank you, he'd meet them for coffee and tell them the same thing Dr. Torres had told him. You're stronger than any system that tried to tell you otherwise. 2 years after the surgery, on a bright October morning, James woke up in his bed, in his house on Maple Street, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, though he was happy. Not contentment, though he was content. Just peace. The knowledge that he'd been given a gift, a second chance, and he'd used it well. His garden was thriving, his children were healthy, his grandchildren visited often, filling the house with noise and laughter, and his heart, that new valve clicking steadily in his chest, was strong. He got up, made his coffee with 2 scoops and a pinch of cinnamon, and went out to the porch. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air smelled like autumn, crisp and cool, and James sat down in his chair, the same chair he'd been sitting in for 50 years, and watched the world wake up around him. He thought about Dr. Torres, about Rachel, about the strangers who had donated money to save his life, about Eleanor, who he still missed every single day, but who he knew would be proud of what he'd built with the time he'd been given. And he thought about the system that had tried to tell him he wasn't worth saving, about all the people who were still fighting that system, still being told their lives didn't matter enough. He couldn't fix all of it, couldn't save everyone, but he'd done what he could. And sometimes he thought, that's all any of us can do. Just keep showing up, keep fighting, keep believing that every life, no matter how old, no matter how inconvenient for some spreadsheet somewhere, matters. The sun cleared the fence line, and James took a sip of his coffee. It was strong and sweet, and exactly right. Just like this moment, just like this life he'd fought so hard to keep. If you want more stories like this, stories about people who refused to give up, who fought back against systems that tried to tell them they didn't matter, feel free to like this video. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And here's my question for you. What would you have done in James's situation? Would you have fought the denial, or would you have accepted it? Have you or someone you love ever been denied care that you needed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories matter just as much as James does.